Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 Elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. And today we are playing my favourite system against the French defence, which I think is probably a defence that people struggle with a lot when they play 1e4. And there's so many different things you can do. You can obviously play just the normal exchange variation, the advance variation, there's like the winnower, and all the theory gets very, very complicated. So what I learned a couple of years ago is instead to play this system called the Papa-Ticulat Gambit, which God knows why it's called that. But the point is, you essentially ignore what black's doing in the center. You're happy to give away this pawn, and you just get your bishop on a really good diagonal. And the point is, you're going to win this pawn back. The only way for black to stop you from winning the pawn back is to severely weaken his own center. So my opponent plays the second most popular move, which is just applying more pressure with the knight. Now, however, we're not going to give black the opportunity to take the pawn. We're instead going to kick his knight, which will probably go to d7. And then we're going to follow up with queen to g4. Which is a really aggressive move. And the point is that it's really difficult for black to look after the g7 pawn, because typically with the knight on f6, queen takes g7 can be met with rook to g8 ideas defended by the knight, and black can often generate a lot of counterplay that way. However, here it's a lot more difficult because this bishop can't properly develop, because I will just take on g7 and you're going to have to move your rook to f8. And I could even take on h7 if I want, and you're going to be down at least one pawn. And there's also, if bishop e7, queen takes g7, no bishop to f6, which is another common way to attack the queen and defend the rook. But there's no bishop to f6 because the pawn controls the f6 square. And I have, I'll have two playlists linked below. One of them being all the previous episodes of the speedrun. So if this is your first time to the channel, you can follow all the way from episode 1. And if you want to see other games in this b3 French system, some of them where my opponent does accept the gambit, then I've also got my 2.b3 French defense opening playlist down below, which is basically every video on my channel in this French system. My opponent's taking a bit of a think here, which is fair enough, because queen g4 is kind of not what you would expect. I mean, if you were to just see this position for the first time, you might expect white to play normal moves like d4, bishop d3, knight to f3, maybe f4, probably knight b to d2, and just essentially secure the center. But what we're going to try to do, which is a very common idea, is to play f4. And what we're going to do is try to avoid playing the move d4, because black will probably play c5, right on cue. And if we go d4, then of course there's tension in the center between the c5 and the d4 pawns. So instead we play f4. We secure this pawn with the f pawn, but rather than putting the d pawn, there is no tension in the center. The center is nice and solid, making it difficult for black to break out of this position, right? And we're eyeing up the g7 pawn. We're going to develop our knight, probably put our bishop on e2. Sometimes the bishop goes to d3, but you have to be careful about knight c6, knight b4 ideas. You can play some ideas of knight to a3, knight to b5, and knight to d6, particularly if black tries to fianchetto his dark-squared bishop, which would take its eyes off of the d6 square. Okay, here my opponent goes f5, and I think I've actually had this exact position in an over-the-board game. This is dangerous territory for black. Do not take en passant. As tempting as it looks to do take-take, yes, you open up your bishop, but black can develop. He's got tempo on your queen. Black gets more control of the center because he's trading off an f-pawn for your e-pawn. And although it looks great to open up this bishop, white should not be looking to do that. Queen g3. I don't have to be concerned about bishop to e7, threatening bishop to h4, pinning my queen to my king, because on bishop to e7, I can just take the pawn on g7. And my opponent may play the move g6, but we can then start throwing our h-pawn down the board, maybe go knight f3, knight to g5. We also have ideas of bishop to e2, potentially threatening bishop to h5, and after g6, go take, take, and take. My opponent goes knight c6. We can probably go bishop to e2, because if he plays something like, I mean, obviously bishop e7, we just take on g7. Let's say he plays a6, which is a common move. Then bishop to h5, g6, take, take, take. King to e7 is the only move. I'm not sure whether that's actually winning or not. I don't actually think we have a follow-up. I mean, the king is stranded, but I don't just want to give perpetual checks on g5 and g6. So we could start with knight to a3, preparing this potential maneuver if this bishop were to move. And that might be an idea if we do go bishop to e2. For example, if our knight could get to d6, right, then this would be a lot more powerful, because after king to e7, we could put the knight on d6, threatening queen to f7, and there'd be no queen to e8 preventing that, because our knight would control e8. But that plan is a little bit long-winded. c3 is also a common idea, to reroute the knight to c2, and to try and play d4 in a longer term, like over the longer term, to build up a lot of support for it. Knight f3 also looks absolutely fine. Potentially going knight to g5. That looks reasonable. We could go bishop to e2 to try to spook our opponent. And to be honest, the bishop's going to go here anyway. The bishop's going to go to e2 regardless. If the knight goes to d4, sometimes you take it. And basically go like, you know, my bishop's blocked in anyway, we can just trade. Or you can play bishop to d1, just defending c2 and getting your bishop out the way. Or there's even ideas of knight to a3, guarding the c2 pawn on knight to d4, or on knight to b4, and then preparing the move c3 to kick the knight away, and then potentially reroute our own knight via the c2 square. This is a very non-standard opening system, as I'm sure you can probably tell right now, because we definitely have a bit of a space advantage, and we have more space on the king side. That is that's pretty obvious, right? But black could try and counterattack on the queen side, and in my online blitz games, which I play around the 21-2200 level, a lot of people like to try to castle queen side as quickly as possible because they get very scared about the king side. Okay, my opponent goes knight to b4. Now, let us quickly check, can we go for this? No pun intended. So, of course, if bishop to h5 and the king moves, then just queen g5 and we're winning, right? So we have to look at what happens if we sacrifice our bishop on g6. The king goes to e7. We do not have queen to f6 because the knight guards f6. I don't think we have anything more than a perpetual. If our knight was on h3, maybe we'd have ideas, but we also need to deal with the immediate threat on the c2 pawn. So I'm just going to play knight to a3, which simply defends. And the knight wants to go to a3 anyway. We don't want to put the knight on c3 for two reasons. One, it blocks our bishop. Two, we want to move this c3 pawn to c3 to support d4 in the future. I suppose there's actually three reasons. The third reason is we don't want d4 to come with tempo on our knight. We even want to meet the move d4 with c3, challenging the d4 pawn immediately. Or, if d4 is played, we want to be able to come to c4 and exploit that square. Of course, b5 could be played to preemptively defend c4 and try to stop us from getting into d6. But I think we can just safely go for c3, booting the knight away. And black has basically wasted time doing this, because we wanted to play knight to a3, and we wanted to play the move c3. I would have played those moves anyway. So it's really difficult for players on the black side here to understand what's going on and what is a good plan for them, because this is so strange. My opponent may have never seen this system before in his life, which is pretty rare, right? To be able to do that to somebody in a chess game, and for your system that they've never seen before to not be simply bad. If you're enjoying the video so far, by the way, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. It really helps to motivate me with these daily uploads for you guys. And okay, Again, I don't think that this sacrifice actually does anything. I mean, we freeze the black position. Maybe we can play it and justify it simply based on the fact that black can't really move. But I'd like to do a little bit more than that. Knight to h3 is also very tempting, to try and bring our knight into g5 potentially. There's also no h6, because that would weaken this diagonal far too much. We actually had a similar theme happen in a Vienna game earlier on in the speedrun, where the move h6 weakened the diagonal too much. That was in a very strange variation of the Vienna Gambit, actually. I prefer knight to h3 over knight to f3, because I don't want to block the bishop's access to this diagonal. If knight to h3, g6, knight to g5 attacks the e6 pawn, my opponent, how can he defend that? Let's say queen e7. He could go knight b6, opening up this bishop, but let's say queen e7. Also giving the queen access to f7 in case of sacrifices. Something like h4, h6 looks a little bit dubious. Knight f3 does have the merit of allowing us to push the h-pawn. We could push the h-pawn preemptively, though, and then put the knight on h3. But I also don't think my opponent can stop me from putting my knight on g5. I suppose the only downside is that disconnects my queen from the pawn. But if my opponent's going to play g6 anyway, which I think he probably will, then that's not really the end of the world. Like I said, it's a complicated position, and although I'm pretty familiar with these positions, it's still very difficult. Still very difficult for both sides, which is kind of what I want. I think I'm going to go h4, though. h5 can't be played because of queen g6, right? So let's go h4. I don't really need to worry about my knight contributing to defending the center like this, because as we've already discussed, d4 doesn't really do a whole lot. If anything, it just opens up the c4 square for us, and maybe even this long diagonal for the bishop. We can trade here whenever we want, so that's fine. We're also in no real rush to develop, because we already have a lead in development. We have 4 pieces developed, black has 2. And it's also not clear how he's going to continue his development. For me, it's very clear. You can sometimes castle queenside in these systems. You can also lead your king in the center. A lot of the time you castle kingside, but you don't need to do anything. You can play it in many different ways. Okay, my opponent goes for b5. Again, does this work? We should always keep our eye on whether this sacrifice works. I just don't think we have anything amazing after king to e7. I don't really see our follow-up. We could go knight to c2 to ensure that b4 doesn't come with tempo on the knight. However, even if b4 does get played, we can still probably just go knight to c2. And if my opponent trades, we could take with the bishop or the pawn, but I don't really care that much, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that really matters. We could throw this pawn down the board. Actually, that's not a bad idea. Because if takes, then we have bishop to h5 and there's no g6. If g6, then my opponent can't go bishop to g7, so his position gets really squeezed. Although I'm not sure how we infiltrate then. So maybe knight to h3, knight to g5 is a good idea. I think I'm going to go for it. Knight to h3. And we've completed the development of all our minor pieces and our queen. It's pretty funny that our knights have come to the edges of the board, which is obviously very different from the normal f3, c3 development. But, you know, this is also a non-standard position. With the center closed, like as closed as it is, development also isn't as big of an issue quite so much, because there's simply just fewer lines that are open to be exploited. Okay, this is interesting. Knight to b6. My opponent takes his knight away from the defense of the king side, but does now defend the e6 pawn. Now does this sacrifice work? Does it? We have the ability to go knight to g5. That's what changes. However, we're also not threatening anything on the e6 square because it's defended by the bishop. Also, the king can run to the queen side, so I don't really think that we have anything there. We could consider going d4, but that doesn't really do anything. Doesn't really do anything. If anything, it probably gives black the b4 square and opens up his bishop, which I don't really want to do. So knight g5 does threaten knight h7, rook h7, queen g6, picking up the rook. I think I like that. I think there's a very good chance my opponent misses that idea. I've actually played that exact idea in an over-the-board game, believe it or not. And I won the exchange, and my opponent resigned a few moves later. I think he actually accepted the sacrifice. There was a way for him to have survived, but it was very, very complicated, and I also didn't see it during the game. But this is also a very strange concept when this pawn is on f5, but it's a way that white can win a pawn, essentially, and shatter the king's defenses, because, like I said before, the move h6 would be extremely weakening to this diagonal, right? And, of course, if the h7 pawn just disappears, that's equally weakening, if not more weakening, because the pawn is just gone, rather than being on h6. So I feel very good about our chances here. How can my opponent defend? Well, he could try g6 with the rationale of knight h7, rook h7, queen to g. Oh my god, I can't draw arrows. g6, take, queen g6, and rook to f7. Yeah, I think this just blunders, though. I think this just blunders. But if on this move g6 was played, I think that we can just go h5. And h6 can't be played because after takes, your rook hangs. So I'm pretty sure we can go for this sacrifice. Knight h7. If rook h7, then queen g6, and we pick up the rook, and we're just up an exchange. My opponent could... Oh no, he can't take here because my queen and rook defend that, so that's absolutely fine. Is there a way for him to move his king to somehow save the position? Like, well, and then we just have a check here, if nothing else. And that's almost mate, although there is king to g8, which may survive. But we don't even have to give the check. If here, we can probably just drop the knight right back. And as long as we don't take here with the h-pawn and hang our rook, then we're fine. So let's go ahead and take on h7. A very, very interesting tactical idea. There is also no bishop takes h4, which is important because we do have to be aware of the fact that would pin our queen to our king, but it is supported by the rook as well. And if queen take, then our knight is well defended. That is not a problem. There's no kinds of pins there. If something like take, yes, our knight is defended once, and we can't move our knight because our rook would hang, but we also have knight to f6 check, checking the king and a discovered attack on the rook. And also we can just play a move like g3 to defend our rook and prepare the move knight to g5 to evacuate. So that is also absolutely fine. There's ways for black to try and complicate this, but I don't think any of them actually work. I think probably the reason my opponent played bishop to e7 is because the whole game, my queen has been pointed at his g7 pawn, not allowing his bishop to develop, otherwise I would have taken it. So he was probably thinking, ooh, my opponent just put his knight on g5, which has disconnected his queen from the g7 pawn, so this is my opportunity to develop my bishop. Unfortunately, no, and I did kind of predict this move, because it is the most natural looking move, and knight to h7 is such a strange gambit. Sorry, not gambit, but like a strange tactical sacrifice. It's very non-standard, which I suppose is quite characteristic of this opening. And this is actually the first piece to be taken all game. Well, the first pawn, but the first thing to be taken all game. And my opponent goes king to d7. Okay. Okay, well, we can consider taking on g7. Ooh, rook to g8. I have knight to f6 check. The bishop is pinned and I pick up the rook. That's really nice. Really nice. Do I have any other threats, though? Is my queen getting stranded? Because my opponent doesn't have to go rook to g8. Let's say he just runs his king, trying to go to b8 and get the king out of the way. Well... I'm worried my queen's going to get stuck. That's my only concern. I could go knight to f6 anyway. Of course, the bishop can't take. So queen g7, king c7, knight f6, king b8. Now the bishop can take the knight. Strange position. Very strange. Is there a better move than knight to f6? Is there a better move? Can we play bishop b5? Take, check, king to b8. I don't think we have a follow-up there. Could we go for this now? And try to cut c7 off? I don't think that really works. I'll check with the computer after the game, but I don't think that works. I think maybe just knight g5 is easier. Or maybe I should queenside castle. So that on this, I can take with the pawn because my rook is defended. Maybe that's a better idea. Because if I go here now, and then bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, I hang my e5 pawn, and black is probably better there. So I don't want to do that. I also don't want to get too greedy and take this. I don't think sacrifices on b5 work to cut the king off. So maybe just queenside castle. d4 doesn't do anything, of course. If b4, I think we just drop our knight back. And we're probably fine. It'll be difficult for black to attack us with the amount of pieces we have over there. Wait, what am I on about? My knight's hanging. If I queenside castle, I just lose my knight. Yeah, no, that was really silly. I don't know why I was just thinking that. Okay, well, no, I can't do that then. If knight here, bishop takes, I can take with the pawn, because my queen would be defending e5 and g5, and the queen won't get overloaded. That's not really a problem. So I could go for this. It's not simple. Again, I could try and take g7, but after king c7, I'm just a little bit concerned about where I'm going next. Also, my opponent could take on h4, so I think I should retreat the knight. Let's do it. Knight g5. This isn't really what I wanted to do, but it should be okay. Should be okay. Hopefully we hold everything together here. I spent a good bit of time on that move, though, which means I might have to shut up a bit and focus. I could also castle kingside, actually, with the rationale that the f-file is open, and it's difficult for my opponent to really exploit the fact my kingside pawns are pushed up, especially because all his pieces are on the queen side. I suppose reserving the right to castle either way could come in handy, or just leaving my king in the center, because it's not clear where black should be focusing his efforts then. Because my king could just sit in the center, or it could like teleport to the queen side or teleport to the king side. So let's say, you know, we have an exchange here, which we do, and my opponent starts launching pawns at my queen side. I could just defend, win a pawn, and castle king side, as an example, right? And then my opponent's kind of wasted time and material. c4 might be a good idea, because it's so well supported. I think on c4 I'd probably play knight to c2. Potentially trying to go knight to d4 to get this trade, which should benefit me. Yeah, this pawn is weak. I probably have to go pawn d4 here to defend. I don't think queen c7 is that good a move, though, because he just blocked his king's movement. d4 looks pretty strong. And the only move that makes any sense, so let's just play it, d4. I'm not concerned about any of this. If knight to b4, trying to look at c2. Not only is it defended, but I can just go rook c1 and exploit the opening of the c file. I also, again, have these ideas with much more venom because the king won't be able to run queenside. And I could maybe play a move like g6 to try and get my queen into g5 and put more pressure on the king. You know, if my bishop makes it here, my queen makes it here, and my rook's on the c file, that could be pretty devastating. And my bishop could maybe get to a3. So my opponent's got to be careful because I've got the bishop pair, which currently, because the position is so closed, doesn't really show itself because my bishops are pretty passive right now. But they could open up under the right circumstances. Although I suppose if I sack my knight, then the rook would be watching the a3 square to stop this. But in the long run, that is an idea. Maybe if my opponent goes for like bishop to a6, trying to trade bishops with me, if my bishop ends up on b5, blocks his rook off, stuff could happen. But for now, we're just maintaining our pawn up. And these pawns are difficult for black to really do anything about. His light squared bishop's very blocked in. Okay, he goes for b4. Interesting. We could take. If take. I can't really take the queen because he's going to take on a1 with promotion and probably win my rook. I could drop my knight back to defend d4. Of course, if take, I can probably just take and I'm probably fine. Maybe. Although my knight's going to hang and there's maybe tactics. I could take on b4. If pawn takes, though, again, I'm concerned about there being tactics on my knight if it's on c2. Although maybe if takes, queen takes c2, queen takes g7, maybe that works because the king can't go to the c file because of rook to c1 winning the queen. So that's worth noting. Again, I don't really think this works. If bishop takes... Oh, the knight doesn't have any moves. The knight doesn't have any moves. The only place it can really go is c4, but then takes and the d file opens up. So maybe I can go for this. Maybe I can. The knight has nowhere to go. That's interesting. Okay, let me see. Take. Bishop takes. We have 2 pawns, so we're up 3 pawns for a piece, but the knight literally has nowhere to go. So let's say rook b8. Then take. Maybe queen takes. And that just looks good. Maybe queen f2 offering a trade. I don't think I'm missing anything. Let's do it. Let's do it. This is a pretty funny situation. And just bishop a3. And where's this knight going? He could go to c4 and try and claim that he's messing up my pawn structure and try and play queen a5 maybe to cause a little bit of chaos. That might be his idea. Or that might be the idea that he comes up with. Which wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. Knight c4, take, queen a5. If bishop b2, rook b8. Although my queen defends c3. So I could just go bishop to c1. And that's fine. Also... Oh, wait, no. If here, I can just take on d5, because if he takes my bishop, I take his knight, and the king can't take because of bishop to f3 picking up the rook. Not even just an exchange, but the whole rook. Because the king can't move in a way that defends the rook, of course, and the rooks are disconnected because of the bishop. And we should be up so much material there that we can just castle kingside, or even go king f2 in some circumstances, and just be winning. Eh? That doesn't work. You have no checks with discovered attacks on my queen, because my queen takes either of them. And if the knight moves to like here, then I just take your queen. If here queen takes, then I take your knight. And you have no checks. You also don't have this, because I defend that. So I can just take, no? I'm not missing anything. I'm not missing anything. Interesting idea, but it just seems to make my life way more easy. Or way easier. I felt like going for knight to c4, although winning for me, posed more problems, because there's a greater chance that I panic. If you're in a losing position, you should still try to create counterplay. If this, queen a5, maybe I go bishop b2, you hit me with rook b8, and your position starts to come alive. I know your king's on d7 and it sucks, and I know your bishop sucks, but you can try and create counterplay. This, though, this just seems to make my life way easier. Oh, that's a very cool move, actually. It's a cool move, because if I take, then knight to d3 attacks my king, attacks my queen, and this opens up. Also, you can take on c3. However, I can just take your queen, and you can take my queen, but, like, I'm up however many pawns. So that's fine. Yeah. Let's take. Okay. I like the look of the move c4, trying to open things up ASAP against the black king. Maybe even try to save the c7 pawn. This pawn is frustrating. I could try and go rook to h3 to win it, but I don't really want to give away my h4 pawn. I could queenside castle, and then try and go c4. Queenside castle, king c7, dunno. Maybe bishop c1 to eye up the f4 square to target absolutely everything, if the king takes particularly. I think I like that. Let's play it. I'm low on time as well, so I just need to make moves that make sense. I know this looks like an odd move, but this seems to be black's only source of counterplay, right? So I'd like to get rid of it as quick as possible. And c4 doesn't seem to quite work yet. I could also advance my h-pawn and try and get it to h6, but that seems like more of a longer-term plan. Seems like a more long-term plan. And if the rook moves to f8 to stop bishop to f4, then maybe I can go rook to h3, because I can take without the rook taking here, because it's on f8. Here, though, this seems to make my life easier. There's no way I can win the knight, I don't think. I could go c4. That threatens c5. And if c4 take rook d1 check, you also can't defend the knight. And there's no knight to d3 because of this. The idea being the pawn defends the knight. So c4 looks very strong. Let's play it. Try and make my opponent's life as difficult as possible. I don't know if this is defendable. I don't know if he can defend this. Because the problem is the king can't go to a light square to unpin itself while defending the knight. The knight also can't be defended by a rook because the pawn's in the way. Or like this. And now we just have c5 and we win the knight. So let's go. Check. Simple deflection tactic. I mean, admittedly, it's difficult to see from this position, but once c4's on the board, the idea is obvious. And then we just take the knight and we're up a full piece. Which, I know we were up 2 pawns before, and black could try and claim that his pawns are dangerous. But something like d4, rook c1 check, the only way to defend the pawn would be king to d5, then we have bishop to f3 check, he can take my bishop, I take his bishop. Okay, yeah, maybe I was threatening to take that. Let's give a check. Force the king away from the pawns. Now we can pick up g3 if we want, which is very tempting. We just have to make sure these pawns don't cause us too much of a problem and be aware that if the d pawn moves, then g2 will be under attack. But we can probably meet that with a move like bishop to f3, or even kingside castle, which looks like it could be quite good. Getting our rook on the very good f-file. Actually, my opponent's king is pretty stranded. If, like, king to b6, bishop d4 check, taking away the a7 square, the king only has a5. And he's almost in a mating net. I mean, rook c5. If king goes back to b6, we have discovered checks. King b4. There's no checkmate just yet. But the point is, the king is very much stranded. We could just leave it on a5 for the time being. And just find a way to surround it later, we'll have constant threats. Constant threats. So that's kind of cool. Okay, the king runs immediately. Let's give this check. We also stop the d pawn from advancing. I know we're not taking the g3 pawn by doing this, but I like the idea of leaving the king on a5. We could go for this kind of mate, but I don't think we can follow it up. Oh no, maybe we can. Like, if we have this formation, we could swing our rook round to mate here, although the king would have the b3 square. Maybe king d2? Oh, wait, can we not just go a3, threatening rook c5? Yeah, I think we can. Let's play a3. I think there's a very good chance my opponent goes rook c8 to try and trade rooks, because look at how... Yeah, he does that exactly as planned. Let's go king d2, I think. Connecting the rooks. I'm just trying to sap all of my opponent's counterplay here and force him to defend himself. I know I could have picked up this g3 pawn before, but then these pawns start rolling and maybe I have to be concerned. Yeah, he just goes to trade everything, which I understand, but it makes my life incredibly easy, because now he has no counterplay. I'll take on g7 and then I'll just push, and that's game over. So lovely, lovely stuff. I think that my opponent will resign very, very soon, because he's down a bishop and a pawn, and they have two connected passed pawns. Let's push. This bishop can't defend, because here, 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 here. He's not in time, because I will promote. He could go here, 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 but then oh no, then he will have e4, I suppose, but this doesn't work. He's not in time. Then we just promote. I think I can pre-move that. And yeah, my opponent resigns. Very solid game. Very interesting game. The computer says that I made no mistakes. So what we'll do is we'll do a very quick game analysis. And we'll see if there were ways for my opponent to have defended better or not. Okay, so I've just had a look at the computer analysis of this game, and it turns out there were actually many opportunities for me to sacrifice the knight on h7 in lots of different lines. And there was also a quicker checkmate idea towards the end, so make sure you stick around for that, because that was really instructive, the way the computer was telling me to go about that. So the idea of this opening is to sack the e4 pawn, and effectively you win it back immediately, because it's basically impossible to defend, unless you want to cause yourself problems with discoveries on your queen. So my opponent instead goes knight to f6. We attack it, push it back, and go queen g4. The computer doesn't approve of this, but the win rate on this is very, very good. c5, f4. Again, if we go d4 here, you can see the evaluation drop immediately, because we actually have a lot of problems trying to defend ourselves. Queen c7 is an idea, knight c6 will be an idea, bishop b4 will be an idea. So we don't allow black the opportunity. We go f4, and f5 is a mistake. Taking on Besant makes no sense, because knight takes f6, and we can claim that black's position is weak, but black gets quick development. He already dominates the center, because we just traded off our e-pawn. So instead, we don't take, and we just ignore it. Queen g3. We maintain attack on the g7 pawn and pressure on g6 for these ideas with sacrifices. Knight c6, bishop to e2. Knight f3 is also fine. Knight b4 is an inaccuracy. I did mention knight d4 during the game, and I was like, we can either go bishop d1, which is okay, or we can take, which the computer quite likes, and just wants to go knight f3 to attack the pawn, queen b6 to defend the pawn. Bishop c5 would have, of course, lost the g7 pawn. And there's no knight to c6. And then it basically is quite difficult for black to develop, because where's this knight going? Where's this bishop going? Where's this bishop going? We may be giving a pawn back. Well, not giving a pawn back, sorry. We may be giving our bishop away, but black can't develop. And we're about to start attacking here with, again, these ideas. Like if bishop e7, again, we have this knight takes h7 sort of plan. And the best thing for black is knight f8 offering a trade, or king f7 allowing some very interesting lines, which look very, very scary. So my opponent went knight b4, we go knight a3, and his knight on b4 is basically useless. So a6, we kick it away. Again, these are moves we want to play anyway. So if my opponent gives me a reason to do so, we're going to do it. h4 was inaccurate. The computer preferred knight c2, which I did mention during the game was an idea. And if my opponent continues his queenside expansion, then something like knight f3, bishop b7, again knight g5, threatening knight to h7 ideas. Difficult for black to move. Again, bishop b7. We actually have this. And if g6, knight e6, the queen's under attack, g6 is under attack. Oh yeah, of course, sorry. Queen e7 defending the pawn, my bad. Then we have knight h7. If rook takes, same thing. And if the king runs, or queenside castles, let's say, then we can take on f8. We're up a clean pawn. And we can castle queenside too if we want. So h4 is what I chose. b5, knight h3. Again, the computer wants knight c2. Here, the computer really liked the idea of c4, which I mentioned later in the game. Very well supported by the pawns. And then after something like knight c2, it wants knight c5, trying to get into e4. And if we continue with our plan of something like, instead of knight c2, going knight g5, knight c5, and knight takes h7, then there's knight e4. And our queen's under attack, so queen g6, king d7. If here, queen takes, the computer thinks that black is much better. Probably because our queen is trapped because of the squares this knight controls. So very, very complicated. But as it happened in the game, my opponent went knight b6, which is natural. But as I said during the game, this knight leaves the defense of the king side. So now is the time to strike. Knight g5. There's not much black can do, to be honest. Again, if h6, we just give a check and probably go knight f7 and win the rook anyway. The computer's favorite move is knight e7, I suppose covering the g6 square with the knight. But then you just can't develop, and I can just continue maneuvering my pieces. If h6, I can drop back. If the knight comes back here, I have maybe queen g6, maybe not. Let's say bishop d7, h5. The computer wants king f7. I mean, who's going to play like this? It makes way more sense to go queen c7 and try and castle queenside maybe, but this is uncomfortable because we have such a good bind on the king side and we're ready to explode the queen side and try to attack the black king. As it happened, bishop e7 was played. And we have knight takes h7. My opponent doesn't let me win the rook easily because the game would have been much easier this way. My opponent goes king d7. And here we have two moves. The move we played, knight g5, is fine, but we can take on g7. Now my point was, of course you can't do this because of this, and you lose the rook because the bishop is pinned. But I didn't know what to do after king c7. Now this doesn't come with a check. The computer wants knight g5, which I saw. I saw this idea, but I thought my queen was getting trapped. You can't take the knight to try to exploit this pin just yet, because your bishop's still pinned to your king. But I was concerned about moves like rook g8. The computer says, don't worry, just your queen is completely fine, it's not going to get trapped, but that's difficult to actually play. Instead, I dropped the knight back to g5. It was actually, in this position, knight e5, which is a really interesting move. If I take it, then bishop g5, I can't take, because if take, I lose the rook. Trying to overload this pawn. But on knight e5, I can apparently just queenside castle, defending the rook. And after a big exchange on g5, the rooks come off the board, the knight retreats, and material is equal. But after a move like queen to e3, I just dominate this position. Like, black can't play like this. He may be equal on material, but his position is so weak. So my opponent takes. We take with a pawn. We can't really do this because we give up the e5 pawn. And the computer says after d4 we're still better, but we're not quite as good as we were in the game. So instead, we go d4 after queen c7. b4, I went dc5. and after b takes a3, I find bishop takes a3, which I was really, really happy with. And the knight just can't move. Now, I thought knight c4 was better to try to create complications. And after bc4, queen a5, if I play a passive move like bishop to b2, then rook ba, I'm still better. But black generates a bit of counterplay, and I can maybe go wrong. Like, let's say I go rook b1 here, then the black is better. I can mess this up. Instead, my opponent decides to take on e5, which was very strange. A very strange decision, because I just take on b6. These discovered checks don't work. Sorry, not discovered checks, but discovered attacks don't work, because I can just take the knight. And I defend c3. My opponent farmed f4, which is a really interesting idea. You know what the computer's favourite move is here? Try and find it. You won't find it, but try. Try, because it's hilarious. It's h5. Ignoring the hanging queens and just moving the pawn one square. Like, I mean, the point is both queens are hanging. I mean, if you move your queen, now I can take on f4 because there's no discovered checks. And if you take on c3, I have king to f2. It's just hilarious. I just, no, that's a bit too far forward. Let's go back. No, there we go. I just took the queen. The point is, if I take this, then knight to d3, my queen's under attack, my king's under attack, and my queen is under attack. So after this, I'm down a queen for a bishop. So, of course, I don't fall for that. I instead just take the queen. My opponent takes my queen, and I go bishop c1. A move I was really happy with. Again, the computer wants h5. But the point is that by playing bishop c1, I'm saving my pawn. The best move is rook f8, which is counterintuitive because you're stepping off of the important h-file, and I can probably just force trades with you, to be honest, and you still can't take this because of bishop to f4. I'm saving the pawn through tactics. My opponent takes bishop f4, pinning the knight, king d6 only move to defend the knight, and c4. The computer liked taking the pawn on g3, but I liked c4 because it solves the tension much quicker. Bishop b7, there's nothing black can do. c5 check. King takes. Bishop e5. Rook hg8 I thought was a bit of a not passive move, but it gave up. d4 was probably a little bit more ambitious to try and create counterplay. Of course, black is losing, and I think I was going to go for this to pick up the bishop, or even just do this and threaten this. Those were the kinds of ideas I had. But my opponent makes my life easy. Rook c1, king b6, bishop d4, forcing the king to a5. And here, the computer finds a way to force checkmate in 8 moves. Try and find the sequence if you can. It's not that intuitive, I don't think, but try. The move's b4 check. And either the king goes to a4, and I do this, and we go rook h3. Or the king takes on b4, and after rook b1, the king is forced to the a file because the bishop's cut off the c file. And then we go bishop c5, force the king to take. We go king d2 to cover the c file alongside the bishops. And black can't do anything about rook a1, rook b1. And it's just checkmate. I didn't see this. I instead went a3, setting up a mating net. And I essentially forced black to offer me trades. He can't do anything else. I'm happy to accept the trades, of course, and then it's just a completely winning endgame. The bishop can't stop my pawn from promoting, and my opponent resigns on the 36th move. So, a very interesting game. I hope you guys enjoyed it a lot. If you want to see another really interesting game in the 2b3 French defense, then check out the video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, check out the playlist down here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.